Welcome to Stand Up for Doctors. I'm your host, Kim Downey. Thank you very much for joining us. I'd like to welcome Dr. Courtney McKeown. Thanks for joining us today, Courtney.
Thank you, Kim. It's McKeown, but I'm
Oh,
still
I'm
learning how to
sorry.
pronounce it anyways. I just changed my last name, honestly, about 3 months ago. My husband and I have been married for 9 years. It's a long story, but I finally
Oh,
took his last name, so I'm still getting used to pronouncing it myself. But
okay. All right. Well, I'm very happy to have you, and I'm going to give a very brief introduction because I want you to do the talking. So I'll
sure.
just share that Courtney is a general surgeon and an advocate for physician mental health, which I am as well, in a different capacity. And today we'll be talking about your journey and also PHPs, physician health plans, by way of offering a balanced perspective about them. So I always ask in the beginning what you'd most like our audience to know about you, and it could be where are you in your life right now. So feel free to share anything, including hobbies.
Yeah, God, there's a lot because I feel like I've learned a lot more about myself since being in recovery. But I guess I'll start with that is that I have been in recovery from mental health and substance use disorder for now. I've been sober for 3.5 years, a little over 3.5 years, and that me getting to that point honestly was I had to hit a pretty dark spot, or I think Dominic Corrigan, who you've had on before, may have mentioned as like the rocky bottom.
Mhm.
Not everybody has to get to that point, but I had a lot of denial for a long time, and so getting through that was probably honestly, even considering I'm a surgeon and all of the training and all of that, that's been the hardest thing I've ever done. And coming back from that, so that is one thing. But I do love. I'm actually in Tennessee right now, in Middle Tennessee, about 45 minutes south of Nashville, which is a big thing for someone who's been living basically in New England for the most part all their life. And that's kind of a funny little story about how I wound up here in this private practice with a mutual colleague of ours. But dog mom, we're trying to start a family. I love to golf. I love huge sports fan. So, I have a lot of hobbies outside of medicine too, but I really truly just love being a surgeon. And I also found that, anything that you do for work, though, that could be taken away from you, you can't really, that's not your identity, and that's where I was a little bit astray a few years ago when things got pretty dark, because I know now that if, I don't know, God forbid I get a car accident and I can't use my hands anymore or something, I have another purpose in life, which is, doing a lot of this work. And I've really just entered the space of maybe 6 months ago or so when I started sharing my story, and I'm still trying to figure out exactly what I'm going to do with it on a more formal basis, but I'm getting involved in a lot of different things like advocacy work. We both, I think, are ambassadors for the Lorna Breen Foundation, which is a very near and dear to my heart. And then also, I'm actually been starting to have some talks with actually Dom at Physicians Anonymous to start leading being a group leader for one of their support groups. And we're still, figuring out which days might work, as I'm starting to have a little better sense of my schedule now that I've been here for a few months. And, but at any rate, so it's honestly put me in touch with a lot of just amazing people like him and yourself, and, my current partner at work. And, that wouldn't have been possible had the bad stuff not happened, and had I not first addressed my own, I had to take control of my own mental health and my, come to terms with my, um, history of addiction and all that, and get that taken care of before I could help other people. It's like you can't give away what you don't have. And I'm, firmly a believer of that.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing all of that. And one interesting thing you said, as far as like recovery being the hardest thing that you've done, and you're a surgeon, you've had to do a lot of hard things in your life. And I recently had on a Shelley Halligan, and she's a nurse practitioner, and she a year and a half ago fell. She was in Florida at her sister's house. There was an empty swimming pool. She fell backwards, destroyed a lot of bones. Her recovery, it's an ongoing recovery. And you'd
Mhm.
think that that is the hardest thing she's ever got through. But she said, to put it in perspective, that no, the recovery was the hardest. And I can connect you to, because she now helps people, with that. She's really, she's, fantastic. And yeah, and I recently had her on. And so your story reminded me of that. And
Yeah.
I was wondering if you just wanted to speak. So we have a largely physician audience. Not
Mhm.
everyone is a physician. If you wanted to speak a little to how training as a female surgeon, might have led to some of the difficulties that you had. This just the stresses and all.
Sure. Yeah, I think part of it is the protoplasm being me. I knew, although I didn't really know to the extent, honestly, until after my issues came to a head, but I have a very strong history of addiction, some mental health issues on both sides of my family. We just lost my uncle, my dad's only brother, suicide actually about 4 months ago. And but there's also a lot of addiction history on both sides as well. So I was, it's sort of one of those things like any other disease where you have some, whether it's genetic component, but then there's obviously a perfect storm of things that can happen. I think also surgery tends and medicine really in general, but especially surgery tends to select out for these individuals who like myself, have these traits that when, they can work for you, like the attention to detail and kind of perfectionist where it's not, pathologic quite yet, anxiety and sometimes those things are protective because I'm always trying to get better and learn more, do more. But it obviously has a very, it can, it's a slippery slope in terms of getting to there. But I'm always, I still have to work on this part. I'm very self-critical and don't always give myself a lot of grace when it comes to work. And, I'm learning that now, just, getting into my practice again, because I've been out for a year and a half. And I find myself like I have a partner who has to remind me all the time, like, you're not supposed to be able to do all of the things that I do. I've been in practice a lot longer. It'd actually be an insult to me, and I have to remember that. And I think that those things, it's kind of like it sort of sets the foundation for then if you have a few adverse things that occur and stressors that occur in life, it's almost like a perfect storm that can lead to addiction if you happen to have a predisposition to it. So, yeah, I mean, I grew up in north of Boston and basically I did med school in New York. I wasn't intending on being a surgeon when I went into medical school. I just knew I wanted to be a physician. I thought maybe an oncologist because I had a lot of family members who've had cancer and had really great experiences with their oncologists, and that's definitely was uh, impacted me a lot. And but when I did my third year rotations, I did well in all of them. But surgery, I think a lot of people describe it this way. It kind of picked me.
Mm-hmm.
And I can even just like think now, like doing cases and stuff. I have such enthusiasm for it. It's the only thing that really I'm okay with waking up at 4 or 5 in the morning, whatever the time is, or in the middle of the night, to go operate on somebody. But then there's the aspects like I think it turns all the right parts of my brain on. Like I still have to play diagnostic. I can't pronounce that word. Basically be a little bit of a problem solver, not just a technician. And I do like working with my hands and leading teams and sports were a big part of my upbringing. So the OR environment has a very similar vibe with the teamwork. But there was something else I was going to mention. I'm forgetting what it was now. At any rate, I also like the relationship you develop with your patients. I mean, there's sometimes, and I've appreciated this more now being in practice as an attending for a couple of years, more so even than when I was a resident, where you're kind of just go, 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 go.
Mm-hmm.
You're meeting them. It's, potentially the scariest moment of their life. And the it's always something I take a lot of pride in is being able to communicate well and in terms that they can understand. I do a lot of crappy drawings, but I do my best to try and, figure things out. And that's honestly been a really rewarding aspect of it too, and sort of reinforced, why I'm doing this. But that being said, training anywhere is difficult. I think having that perfectionist and kind of somewhat of an imposter syndrome and not feeling like I'm ever good enough and sometimes looking to other sources for validation rather than just myself. And I think in training it's hard to do that because hard not to do that because you're being evaluated by your attendings. You want them to like you and be able to think you're good. So those struggles can become pathologic though, and certainly was in my case. Um, I, had an addiction initially to a stimulant medication when I was in research sabbatical. So just for people, I guess, who aren't in medicine, I trained at Beth Israel Deaconess, which is a Harvard teaching hospital in Boston. And honestly, I had a great residency experience, for residency. Um, it is normally a 5-year training program if you're going into a clinical, just like a general surgery residency, but a lot of the academic programs, such as mine, do have a research component built in or some sort of professional development time where you're actually taking 2, sometimes even 3 years out in the middle of your residency to whether it's do research, get an MBA. They're a little bit more diverse with the things people are choosing to do now during that time. But this was after my PGY3 clinical year. I went into the lab. And it was one of those things where I had, experimented a little bit with that medication, knew it was something that would make me a little more productive and focus better. And I started taking it when I was in research because I felt so overwhelmed. And that quickly spiraled. I mean, I got addicted to it pretty fast, developed a tolerance, started taking doses of it that were just, unphysiologic, and it eventually developed into a mental health crisis requiring hospitalization, which is where I initially became involved with a PHP when I was in Massachusetts. And that would have been late 2017, early 2018. So, that's where my first experience was in Massachusetts with the PHS there. It's a little bit of a different program today than it was when I was there, totally different leadership. I'm also a different person now too, but I did find it I felt a little bit like it was a little bit punitive and the way that they were speaking to me, but I also knew I was somebody who clearly needed to be monitored. I mean, based on my presentation and what had happened. And it didn't, it did allow me to stay anonymous at that point to the medical board. It was somewhat voluntary, although, I think Carrie Cunningham may have described this in her viral talk a couple years ago. It's more like being voluntold, because my
Hmm.
program director knew, what was going on, and rightfully so wanted to make sure that I was okay to go back into clinical residency. I mean, I had a psychotic episode, and who knew why that happened? I knew, but I hadn't told anybody yet.
Hmm.
That eventually came out. So, I mean, I can just sort of pause there as I know that my story has a lot of different twists and turns, and that's, the first part.
Sure, absolutely. And thank you for sharing. And when you spotlight things like imposter syndrome, feeling overwhelmed, I just say so many times that every time a doctor shares their story, another doctor feels less alone. They're like, wow, me too, just to validate the experiences that you're all having. So thank you, because every single one of you who bring these things up, it makes a difference. It's going to make a huge difference. So, of course, I want to make sure that we have time to talk about PHPs, because I did, as you mentioned, a while back have on Dr. Dominic Corrigan and Dr. Pamela Weibel. And Pamela has had some poor experiences with of doctors she know of, being involved with PHPs. However, I know at least another physician who had a positive experience with a PHP, and you did as well. And it's so important for doctors to have safe resources that they can trust. So we really need to have a balanced perspective out there and share whatever information that we can. So we don't want to eliminate any resources for doctors that could truly help them. So
Right.
to kind of unpack that, would you like to share a little bit about your experience with the PHPs?
Yeah, and I will say, I mean, I respect both of the work that they're doing. I did come across probably some of the writings that people who, I don't know if they were familiar with Pamela or had similar viewpoints when I first got involved in it. It actually kind of terrified me and made me like not want to tell them what was really going on. And it's just, it's tough because so physician health programs, just for those who don't know, these are not, sometimes misconstrued as being medical board. These are entities that are supposed to be separate from the medical board and almost serve as a buffer between the physician and the board so that you could potentially get, if you have a potentially impairing condition, whether that's substance use that certainly is the most common reason someone might get referred, but they're also disruptive behavior or some potentially impairing mental health conditions, because some of it can be, if you have like schizophrenia or something like that, I mean that could potentially impair you. They are serving as a buffer so that, because unfortunately the medical boards, and this is where my fear always comes when I hear a lot of the sort of criticisms of the physician health programs is that, I mean, if they went away, we're just going to get monitored by the medical boards. And
Mm.
I can tell you, I've been monitored by one. You don't want that either. No system is perfect. And I think a lot of, honestly, the effectiveness and maybe even the level of confidentiality and compassion that you get is very state dependent. I know Dominic's talked about that before. And really, when he means like state dependent, it's really dependent on the medical board's general, how the medical board is. And those are actually state laws that have to get passed. So, like, for example, we can talk about a little bit my experience in Ohio, but, in Massachusetts, I had already been out for, and I'd heard horror stories about how much I was going to have to pay to get treatment and get
Mm.
evaluated, and heard things like, oh, $10,000 evaluation and then, potentially 50 grand for a 3-month inpatient stay. And I do have to say, those stories do occur. I look back now and wonder, it may have just been worth it for me to have done it at the time because ended up spending a lot more money, I think, on lawyer fees and subsequently all the treatment. But at any rate, I was actually given the option by them to not do I did not have to do an inpatient program and I did not have to do a 3-day evaluation. It was an outpatient evaluation. The outpatient evaluation was out of pocket, but it was a lot cheaper than, those 3-day going away things. And they were somewhat flexible with me with that. And, I did a 6-week, I think, outpatient program at McLean Hospital for addiction and mental health. And then I signed a monitoring contract with them for 3 years. So, I went back and the monitoring contracts are fairly, there's some variation, but it generally involves some level of drug testing, whether that's, urine, blood, or, depending on your drug of choice, potentially, breathalyzers. In my case, it was mainly urine testing because they'll test you for, I did have alcohol issues for sure, that were related to the Adderall. And they would test you for metabolites that are in your urine for, potentially up to 3, maybe even 5 days afterwards. So they can sort of pick up drinking that, but I actually was starting to mess with that a little bit once I got to Ohio, to be honest, in terms of drinking in between drug tests, which was not, eventually
Mhm.
that was not a good outcome, obviously. But then there's meeting attendance, going to 12-step program, and having a psychiatrist and a therapist who have specialty in addiction. And I think that particular aspect of the structure is probably what ended up saving my life later on, 3.5 years ago when I had that dark, bottom, because I was still seeing the same psychiatrist I had in Massachusetts and had developed a trusting relationship with him. And he was the only one I had told initially when I had had a return to use. But I've been in 4 different PHPs now just because of, I think when it happens when you're in training and you're maybe towards the end of it, there's a lot of changes of jobs and fellowships. So I've been to Massachusetts is where I started. I had 2 years there after I signed the contract where I was finishing up residency. And I did really well in residency, but I still had another year or maybe it was 9 months left on my contract when I matched into a really prestigious hepatobiliary fellowship in Cleveland. And so I knew I was going to have to transfer my monitoring. So then I became involved with the Ohio Physician Health Program. And I think transitions are really jarring
Mhm.
whenever you're changing jobs. But I'll kind of gloss over that just to talk about the different PHPs. I had had a return to use when I was in my fellowship, basically, where I had started drinking wine at home to deal with. I had not been working a good recovery program, kind of just checking boxes as far as, the meetings and things, and not really embracing it, and having a level of denial, honestly, still about who I was and what, this is just part of who I am.
Mhm.
Um, and at any rate, I didn't have good tools to manage some of the really bad imposter syndrome that was really popping up when I wasn't getting the same external validation I had been used to in residency. So I started drinking wine at home. Big no-no if you're getting monitored. And like many people who have suffered from addiction know, the relapse is always way worse than the initial, and we're not able to really, you kind of put up these, like, you draw these lines in the sand, like I'm never going to do it, in this period of time, and you keep playing with that, risk-taking behavior. So there was at some point I drank the night before a urine test, because I knew it would get tested at some point because I was already on Wednesday night, and so there's only 2 days left in the week.
Mhm.
And of course, I had a urine test the next day, and that eventually came back positive for, the metabolites, and I had to stop working immediately. The physician health program will call your employer and let them know, like, you're on a leave. It was also a little bit stressful because I had the employee assistance program at that hospital also involved, and in some ways that was, I don't know, there's a lot of cooks in the kitchen, which was a little bit frustrating for me at the time. And even looking back now with a clear, more mature mindset, I think that there's some work that could be done in terms of relieving some of the administrative burden that's put on us by having to meet with all these different people and just pick one. But at any rate, um, unfortunately, Ohio at that time, this was in March of 2021, happened to be a very punitive state from a medical board standpoint. The PHP was very, like, the people were very nice. They just, unfortunately, this is a case where I have a, I can feel for them a little bit that they're a little bit handcuffed. I mean, if they don't report something and they're supposed to, that will completely destroy the trust between them and the medical board, and then they'll no longer be able to help, advocate for doctors as well. And unfortunately, that time Ohio's medical board had a policy where if you were already getting monitored and you were drinking, or sorry, not drinking, you had any sort of return to use while you were on monitoring, they only had like a one strike, you're out, like it was like two strikes, you're out kind of rule. And it didn't matter if you were drinking at, like I wasn't, at the time wasn't drinking at work or, I'm sure it would have led to that eventually, let's be honest. But it had it into that point because it got caught early. And but they still, if you were, there was no allegations of anything at work, but because they had to report it, the medical board had a policy, everybody gets suspended, if you have a relapse. And that actually has changed. And that's one of the things I'm appreciative for, the kind of the overall, the federation group that's in charge of the physician health programs, because they've actually been doing a lot of work. And probably disclosure, I do have been doing a little bit of work with them to educate the medical boards on like exactly what these implications are, because I'm actually still seeing, I can handle it a lot better now, and I'm okay. But I mean, there's been a lot of indirect collateral damage that occurred because of that suspension that, it really does impact your career. It doesn't mean it's over, but you have to just, I think it's helpful to be aware of those things. So, at any rate, I had, that was obviously a really dark moment. I've talked about that in other podcasts, and I know we've only got like not that much time, but let's just say I was like acutely suicidal. My psychiatrist, who I had been talking to the whole 2 weeks, where I didn't want to tell my husband what had happened, until I found out I got fired from my job. He was actually talking to me and actually handled that situation very skillfully to a point where I would still pick up the phone the next day, and ultimately led to him calling my husband when I had started giving him more ideas of some sort of a plan that he was not, comfortable with. And, my husband came and got me, and that obviously didn't happen. But it was pretty scary, and went to treatment for a month actually, but it was inpatient treatment, which was covered by my insurance actually. It was Cobra, so it was, pricey because had been fired, but it was covered by insurance. And then there was a lot of steps I had to do to get my license back in terms of, getting different evaluations and the sort. But I ultimately had my license reinstated in September 2021 in Ohio, and then decided to, uh, rather than try and get into a fellowship again or whatnot, it was like I actually just love being a general surgeon. And I had an opportunity during that time too, which is I probably shouldn't gloss over because that's honestly the most important, is that I sometimes when we have these things happen, like you have to, suffer a little bit to really just get it. I mean, I did. Not everybody has to, but I was able to use that experience as an opportunity to actually get the help I needed, but also just like up here, truly believe, like had a level of acceptance that I never had before. And then that allowed me to have willingness to, for me, it was working a 12-step program. That's what worked for me. I know there's different recovery programs, but that has worked really well. I have the same sponsor today I had then, and she's amazing. She's able to get me like, so I still go on these little imposter syndrome, spirals every now and then. Like the other day, I think I didn't check for a hernia on one side and like nobody cared. Like my partner didn't care at all, but I was like, I couldn't even, like, I was just so angry at myself the whole ride home. And then she managed to go, like, basically just talk me down. My husband always says that, like, thank God for Lynn, because anyway, so those are the things that, like, I still struggle with some of those things, but I have tools now to manage them, and people now I can reach out to, excuse me. And At any rate, I was going to be monitored now for 5 years starting in September because of they kind of reset everything once you get disciplined. So I happened to very serendipitously come into contact like with the medical director of the New Hampshire PHP where I had been looking for a job. And she was able to, this is where I've really had positive experiences, honestly, particularly in New Hampshire and now Tennessee, because she gave me kind of insight into the medical hospital landscape there, which hospitals were quote unquote recovery friendly. Helped me I didn't have to hire an attorney to fill out my license paperwork. She actually would look over my questions because I'm always now, because I've had a suspension, as well as they've done with kind of altering licensing questions to protect physicians with mental health and substance use. Because I've been disciplined, I'm always going to have answer yes to certain questions. And she looked that over, kind of said a few things like, maybe you don't need to put this part in. Like I could tell I was still a little bit angry and kind of victim-y about things. And At any rate, I got a full license in New Hampshire. The medical board there is very, physician friendly sounds like the wrong word because it's like they're reasonable. They're just reasonable, And so they didn't have any restrictions on it because I was already signed up with the PHP in New Hampshire. I was at this job that I thought was going to be a long-term job. I don't think I thought I would be there forever, but enough that my husband and I bought a house and everything. And I happened to be working for a for-profit hospital, unfortunately, that had some financial restructuring. And about 10 months into me working there, I got laid off. At that point, I was about 2 years sober. And that was a challenging job search because I then learned that although my job at that time had welcomed me with open arms and I never felt like I had to, I've been fairly transparent always with my employers. It's just more recently I've obviously been talking about it publicly. It was always important to me to throw that out there, at the beginning. And nothing but like respect and admiration. And that's not how a lot of places are, unfortunately, as I learned later. And even though it had been that much more time that had passed. So it took a while for me to find the right fit. And once again, had to do some things like change things I could control and just not, try to give the rest up to, the universe or God or whatever, your higher power sort of is and do the right things. And eventually I came into contact with my now, partner here in Tennessee who, recruited me down here. And I've been working here since July. So now we're going from New Hampshire. Um, I'm going to be monitored, I think, until September of 2026. So I was obviously going to need to transfer again. So spoke to the Tennessee Medical Foundation, which is the PHP here in Tennessee, and they've been amazing. I mean, they're probably like PHP hashtag goals for how to just the way they handle people. I mean, they're just so kind. And most of the physicians, I shouldn't say most, but a lot of the physicians I've come into contact with who are running these are in recovery themselves. Some people, kind of say that as like as a flaw, but honestly, they consider themselves like peers among peers, and it's not like this hierarchical, punitive thing, especially once I actually did the work to get myself healthy, was no longer in denial about it and stopped resisting everything. That's where honestly most of my pain points probably happened early on because I just couldn't get there yet. I really just, you know, But at any rate, I knew I was going to have to interview for my license here in Tennessee just because of the license action. And the medical board here was, it actually kind of brought me to tears just how kind they were about, they have you give a statement and then Dr. Barron, who is the medical director here for the PHP, just briefly spoke on my behalf, just saying they advocate for me and, some of the work I had already started doing some work in this space at that point. But like the board members all just kind of took turns taking the microphone, being like, either welcome to Tennessee, and we're so proud of all the steps you've taken and things that I had not experienced before when dealing with boards. They were just very, human about it. And I also had the opportunity to see how because I had to wait for maybe like a couple hours before my case came up. They really were trying to take into account like the impact of their decisions on, understanding that their first responsibility, of course, is to protecting the public, but whenever possible, they would try and strike a balance and realize like, maybe this isn't necessary. This is gonna, this person has a limited license. They're not going to be able to have board certification or things that you don't realize are downstream consequences. And they really weighed those very heavily, which is not the case in most places. So I think the fact that the Tennessee and also New Hampshire PHPs are so great is because they also have a really great relationship with a very second chance oriented slash just more reasonable medical boards. And so like in Tennessee, for example, you would not, it's not planning on relapsing again, but
Mm.
if I had, they actually wouldn't even need to report me if I agreed to go to treatment. Medical board wouldn't even, necessarily need to find out unless I was resisting, in which case, then, but, and Ohio has since changed their rules, about a year ago, actually. So now a physician such as myself who may have, gives you a chance to, we don't want to think of ourselves as failing or having a relapse or something, but that is sometimes part of the recovery process. And you have to give people a little bit of room if it's safe and they're not harming patients and putting them at risk to stumble a little bit without fear that it's just going to just destroy their career. And so now they take a much more case by case approach. And like that same thing that happened to me in 2021 would not have happened had it, been today that this occurred. And that's why, I've had a lot of respect for, I think, the people in charge of the overall group of the physician health programs, the federation, as they call it. It's like they're not really a governing body, but they kind of an organization that all of the different states go to because they have asked me to kind of collaborate a little bit on some work in terms of educating people. And I'm going to be presenting at like an ACGME conference and doing a panel there. And it's just opened up some opportunities too, to be able to make a difference for people who some of the things I can still say now, like were unnecessary in my case. I still know for me it was necessary because I don't know if I would have gotten to this point. But at any rate, like, there were definitely some things that I think people are disincentivized to get treatment for now or seek help. And some of them are very real. But they are trying to, improve that and also be, I'm kind of advocating, I think, as well as Dominic, for a little bit more transparency in terms of what to expect, because I think that is one of the bigger barriers, because there's not a lot of, you don't, until you're in it, you don't really know what it's like. And it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. If like they had people, I think, who were getting monitored who would agree to be kind of like almost like a big brother, big sister thing or something like that line is one of the ideas I was throwing around. Um, but honestly, like I said, once I didn't resist the program so much, it actually gave back like tenfold, in terms of my recovery. I don't even think about it so much as, I mean, I'm obviously not going to drink or use drugs ever again, but it's so much more about like how I live my life and deal with tough stuff, because life is hard and we have these little curveballs that get thrown in our way, and we still, even when we're doing the right things. And I've been able to handle those situations, one of which I'm dealing with right now, with a lot more grace and serenity than I would have, maybe even a couple years ago, even though I was still sober at that time. And so, yeah, I think that's my main takeaway from PHPs. Sounds good.
Well, thank you for all of that. And I do have a question that doctors might wonder about the PHPs. I'm so glad that you had a good experience and it sounds like you felt respected, and that's really important to share. And I was wondering if there's a way to know or tell, like, where are the good ones and what states? And also, do physicians have any control over the PHP that they would be involved with?
Sure. So as far as the first question, actually, I'll answer the second question first because it's a little more straightforward. The PHP they're involved with, I mean, it really depends on where there's only one PHP for each state, and unfortunately, not every state has one. Almost all of them do. I think California is one of the states where it actually is a good example of what happens when there's not a PHP there because their medical board has been really um, you know, very punitive towards a lot of physicians and it's caused a lot of physicians to leave that state. And so they're working on getting approval to have one. But at any rate, in terms of, it really just is wherever you're practicing. So like there's, I think California, maybe Nebraska, and there's probably, I think there's one other state I'm missing that may not have one. But otherwise, you've probably chosen where you're going to be working, and that's the PHP you'll have. Now, as far as choice about if you need treatment, I guess I'll backpedal a little bit. The PHPs don't always, I think, Chris, one of the people who's in charge of another state in Washington has actually given these statistics, like in terms of the breakdown of who they get referred to them, like 40% of those people don't actually ever get monitored by them because they determine that, this is something that's not potentially impairing. They can be seeing somebody for an outpatient, or it's just obviously a frivolous, referral, things like that, like, the whistleblower situations. So if they don't, they don't always monitor everybody. Now, in my case, which was appropriate, certainly, needing to be monitored, more likely than not, you're also going to have some treatment before, engaging in a contract in order to get back into work. In Massachusetts, when that happened, I think they gave me three or four different choices. They were all places that, they did pick places that are known to have a physician or a professional addiction specialist program. As a result, a lot of those places tend to be a little bit expensive, and many of them are not in the same state. And that's where the prices kind of come into play. Now, in my case, they did give me an option of an outpatient treatment program, like we talked about before. So I naturally, as a poor resident who had 300 grand in debt, you know which one I picked.
Mm.
um, there's a little bit of controversy about whether that's wasn't sufficient or not, and I think I definitely benefited a lot from inpatient, but I also knew that the biggest change happened in me in terms of me
Mhm.
actually doing well. It was more about my general attitude and embracing the program and all of that stuff that really made all the difference. But certainly when I had to actually go into inpatient treatment a few years ago, that was mandated, although I was already kind of doing it already, but by the medical board, they already told me which places were treatment, board approved treatment providers. There was a much longer list, excuse me, in Ohio for that. And many of the programs were in Ohio, and many of them, if you had your decent insurance, were, mostly covered. So it wasn't a huge financial barrier for me, and I did pick one of the ones in Ohio. They gave options also elsewhere. I don't know how every state does it. I think that they give you some choice, but there's not like you can just go pick your own place because, in some ways they want to make sure that they're um, somewhere that you're actually going to get a benefit from, I guess. I mean, obviously there's not all treatment centers are made are equal. Um, and they do tend to obviously select for places that are a little bit, pricier and
Mhm.
whatnot. As far as and then your first question was about knowing which how if you can figure out. Yeah, so that's interesting. There's not. I know that Dominic had mentioned that on your episode that you had with him about that. It's also something I'm actually interested in collaborating on trying to come up with a database because that is the biggest thing is no one really knows. I think your biggest litmus test right now is to look look at the medical board of that state, though, because as I said before, more likely you're going to have if the medical board seems to be reasonably, and actually a good litmus test for that is if they've got those badges from the Lorna Breen Foundation, right?
A
Now that we
hundred
have that,
percent. Yes.
so Tennessee has a, I forget what they call it, a badge of honor or whatever, and that's because they have changed their licensing credentialing questions. And any state that's going to do that is going to generally be open to change, and I can tell you for sure the Tennessee Medical Board is like that. Interestingly, New Hampshire doesn't have that badge, but I think it's more just because it takes them forever to do certain
Mm-hmm.
things because they are actually a very, very kind board.
Mm-hmm.
And so I can say, like from my experience, I've had very good experiences with Tennessee and New Hampshire. I think that now the Ohio PHP, and I still have to meet with them now because I'm sort of beholden to them until since my original quote unquote offense was in
Mm-hmm.
Ohio, the board has now given over control of even the people who got disciplined over to the PHP as well. So I just meet with some of their people like once a quarter and say hi, and then
Mm-hmm.
Tennessee sends them some compliance letter or something
Mm-hmm.
to make sure. And I will be getting out of this unless I make another, fumble.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not planning on doing. You do get out of them in your period of time, like 5 years, or I think there's a few places that might do 3, but in my case, it's most states it's 5.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so I can say also I would say Washington for sure, just because I know the individuals and work there. And I'm sure there's other states as well, but because I don't have any, I haven't had a lot of personal contact with them, I just wouldn't want to like give people the wrong
Mm-hmm.
information. But I know that Washington kind of handles their program very similar to how Tennessee does. And there's a lot of things that they do that I think, kind of get taken for granted too. And I didn't even know, like when I was signing up for malpractice insurance in Tennessee, because anytime you've had a disciplinary action now, and even if you've, happen to be in a state where the license questions are kind and you didn't have an action, that doesn't guarantee that your disability insurer provider they could still ask you those questions. Your
Mm-hmm.
hospital could still ask you those questions. You might still get like quote unquote, outed somewhere if you have a mental health condition.
Mm-hmm.
And in my case, everything takes longer now as a result, right? Because now they have
Mm-hmm.
to like look over things more whenever I have to answer yes to a question at each insurer. And one of the funny little anecdotes is like the major malpractice provider in Tennessee had said, you answered yes to this question. So now instead of just giving you an approval, we have to commit, meet and wait till our next committee meeting to
Mm-hmm.
meet. And that's going to be a month from now. And I'm like, come on, like I've already waited 4 months for my life. Like it's just,
Mm-hmm.
and it was hilarious because that same day I got an email from Dr. Barron and he's like, Courtney, I'm going to be speaking on your behalf at the Arkansas, like they have a branch in Arkansas, I guess, like this insurance provider. So I heard about your case. I got it moved to Arkansas. They're going to talk about it, and I'm going to advocate on your behalf. Can you please sign this consent form saying you're letting me talk on your behalf? And I was like, what? And then I got a malpractice the next day. I mean, so that is just like one of the little things that I think sometimes gets overlooked, and they really are trying to just you know, help us. I think where it gets sticky is when people aren't sure if they need the help or not.
Mm-hmm.
And I think some of the stories I've heard, maybe it wasn't the case, and I don't know, but certain states,
Mm-hmm.
obviously, they have bad medical board, then they're kind of in a little bit in trouble too. But
Mm-hmm.
also there are some where I can read and I can tell by the tone of it, that's somebody that sounds just like I did, or maybe worse than I did
Mm-hmm.
like 7 years ago when you can tell there's like an element of denial. So I just don't want those to be the only stories out there. I think everybody deserves to,
Mm-hmm.
obviously it's a freedom of speech. I just I worry that those ones are what's scaring some especially younger docs away who really need the help,
Mm-hmm.
and
And
there's
that's
other
exactly,
resources.
yeah, and
Yeah,
that's exactly why I asked you to come on and speak to this, right? And
yeah.
also the fact that you're sharing these things, you're not just, you're another face showing that doctors are human. Like doctors are human beings and they have all the stresses and struggles that other human beings have, right?
Correct.
It can, anything that happens to another human can happen to a doctor, like because they are human. And your story is also, I'm so sorry that you've been through everything you've been through, but it also speaks to the fact that nothing is insurmountable, and it's also inspiring when you're coming forward on the other end. And I'm sure that you're an amazing surgeon and that you're able to, that you're still practicing as a surgeon and using your gifts in the world. So everything was really hard, but I was wondering as we wind down if you just like to speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, when I found out I had gotten fired and I knew I was facing a license suspension, 3 years, 7 months ago, I thought everything was over because first of all, I only identified myself as a surgeon. I mean, I basically put off all of these life things. Um, we're still trying to start a family, but now I'm 40. At the time I was 36, and it's like everything just was about, I was like this close to finally being done, and then I just blew it. Like, or that's how I saw it. I mean, in a way I did, but I'm a lot nicer to myself about it now.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and it really didn't seem like I didn't understand how I could possibly get back into a career. It really, when you're in that spot, anybody who's in it, whether it's due to addiction or other issues, knows everything seems hard and you can't possibly see really the forest from the trees. So I just got little by little got better and better and started doing the next right thing. And I had a lot of support, obviously. My family, my husband especially, and just reaching out to people for help and letting them help me. Once I did that, it was actually not that, it wasn't really that hard. And it helped me deal with a lot of struggles after that. So, like the layoff was a big blow, but um, uh, and there were times where I certainly was a little bit more disheartened than other times. I wouldn't say I was completely had all the faith in the world 24 hours a day when I had been, getting rejected from jobs that I would have thought I was like overqualified for.
Mm-hmm.
But it taught me a lesson and uh I think I probably wouldn't have been doing this right now, for example, because
Mm-hmm.
it wouldn't have given me that kind of like fire to
Mm-hmm.
try and make a difference. I think I may have just kind of rode off into the sunset once I was done with my contract and, just, been sort of not really known to many people. And there's obviously a lot of people who are hurting because I've heard from them now. And that's
Mm-hmm.
what's really kind of great about this whole thing is that every time I share, I usually hear from, either people I've known already or just random strangers who
Mm-hmm.
are like the me's from a few years ago, but they're going through it now and knowing that that's actually giving them some hope and helping them and giving them a roadmap has given me an incredibly amount of just, it's just incredibly rewarding. But yeah, there's been tough things, and the layoff thing was a good example too of like, I hate that everything happens for a reason, but like also,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, it's kind of like that a little bit. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
God at work in a way. Because
Yeah.
like I kind of ended up getting synced up with this person who I had been, Amy Ortiz. I think you may be,
Mm-hmm.
I forget if you guys are connected or not, but she's been running this podcast and coaching school for a while for surgeons, and I've been listening to the podcast for maybe a year and a half or so, and then like always kept admiring her insights and being like, oh, she'd be a great person to work for, but I would never
Mm-hmm.
move to Tennessee. That's crazy,
Mm-hmm.
And then I finally was like open to geographic, location changes. And I happened to, ask a question in one of our webinars about, it was like a free webinar about like people who get laid off basically, because it's a big problem right now in medicine. And then she emailed me the next day and was like, I'm actually looking for a third partner. Like, would you be interested in kind of the rest is history from there?
Mm-hmm.
So I've been working out here for a few months and she's just great because she helps me with a lot of the other extracurricular stuff too and was encouraging me to share my story and it's great to be, like that's your same person who you're having to ask to bail you out of the OR maybe when you're in trouble. So
Mm-hmm.
it's kind of cool. And that helps like so having a couple of those things kind of go in my favor eventually then help me with this more latest frustration, which is having a little bit of a delay in starting, operating.
Mhm.
I'll kind of leave it somewhat vague for now, but we have some issues with this hospital that they're affiliated with that's kind of stuck in the 1950s and has a problem with having a gap that I had. And we've figured out an alternative solution that's actually going to be much better than what I thought I was going into. But at the time, the first 2 months were really just a roller coaster of emotions for actually both of us. It just
Mhm.
hurt us in different ways.
Mhm.
But the point is, like, I had had enough, I think, good things happen to me in recovery when I just tried to like not be, oh, woe is me, and try and just do the next right thing. And then once again, that, ended up being the case and working out.
Mhm.
So yeah, it really isn't. I think that that's a trick our brain tells us when they say, you can't come back from this, because that's just not true. I had heard a
Mhm.
lot of stories of people who had vague things like, oh, people came back, but sometimes I would hear it and they didn't actually go back into medicine or didn't go back into surgery or, whatever. And I'm just here to tell you that if you want to go back into medicine and surgery, and if I wanted to go back into a fellowship, I could have done it. I would have figured out a
Mhm.
way. And I think that once you really have to take care of your health first. So that's the big thing.
Mhm.
I wouldn't have been right for this job 2 years ago even. I
Mhm.
had to even do more self-discovery work and more
Mhm.
just like even recovery work in order to get to like a certain mindset where I'm actually, you're kind of get attracted to the people you're supposed to be kind of synced up with, if that makes sense.
Mhm. Yeah,
So
no, it
everybody wants to
does.
be an advocate when they first get into recovery, and it's like, chill. Wait, hold on
Mhm.
the brakes. Like, look, this is one of those things you have to kind of like look in the mirror a little bit and take care of that first, and then this can come if but you have to get your own house in order, so to speak, first before you can help other people. So
That's
that's
100% true. And people have to know and understand and experience that deeply is the just
yeah,
that change in mindset. Like you can't fake it. That doesn't work. And you can try to fool yourself, but in the end, if you try that, it won't work. And
right. Like I was saying, I think like because you're like, oh, I'm so sorry that you have to go through all those things, but I mean, first of all, we all have everybody has their struggles, whether they talk about it or they don't. And that just happened to be my, quote unquote cross to bear. And every time something's bad's happened, something much better has come of it, whether it's just me being a better person and more relatable, but usually there's some lesson I'm always able to glean out of it, and I always come out better. But that's because I also have the mindset now where I am looking for that. I'm not looking for like the I'm so sorry and pity party on myself kind of thing.
hmm
And
right.
that's hard because there's some things that are really just, they're not right that happen to people. But I think even in those circumstances, we can sometimes look and be like, well, what part do I play in this? And what can even if it's just that you let it affect you so much,
hmm
because ultimately I think there's always some reason we're having to deal with a struggle. And once we address that, I don't know, it becomes easy and life can be really great.
Exactly. So the last two quotes I'll end with before I ask how our listeners can get in touch with you is my physician coach, Dr. Michael Hirsch, says, whatever happened was supposed to happen because that's what happened. So sometimes I find that a little more comforting than everything happens for a reason. They're just a
Yeah.
little bit different. So that's helped me through some things when he said that. And then Dr. Behruz Bebad says, there's always a path forward, right? There's
Yeah.
always a way
There's
forward. And I
always a
think
way,
you're
yeah, and there's always
demonstrating.
another way forward, and I think you always have a choice.
Mm-hmm.
So don't let your brain try and tell you that
Yeah.
otherwise, and yeah, those are great.
Yeah. Well, thank you. So, how can our listeners get in touch with you? And is there any resources I can put them in the links you can send me later for physicians?
Sure. I mean, they can get in touch with me. I am on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Facebook, if they just search, I think Courtney Barrows McKeown on Instagram, or sorry, on Facebook and LinkedIn, they should be able to find me. And I'm always happy if they want to message me, and even if it's just like, hey, I'm dealing with this right now, and whether it's advice or just a friendly ear, I'm always happy to do that because it really does help me too.
Mm-hmm.
So don't feel afraid to do that. And then Instagram, I think is Dr. Court B. McEwen, MD. But again, I think if you search my name in Instagram,
Mm-hmm.
you can find me too. Um, and the last one what was the last thing you asked?
Resources for physicians.
Oh. Yeah, so I think depending on what your potential issue is, but I think in terms of especially for addiction, some things that are outside of the PHPs that you want to dip your toes in the sand and you're not, at quite a PHP level might be so your local caduceus meeting, which is really just code for doctors, a doctor AA group. Usually every major city has one. It's a
How do
little
you
hard to
spell
find.
that?
CADUCEUS. Sometimes they can be hard to find. The best way to sometime initially start is so if you go to IDAA, it stands for International Doctors and Alcoholics Anonymous. If you have a substance, if you have a drug problem that's not alcohol, that's okay too. Just that's an anonymous, it's literally AA for doctors, and you don't have to actually give any of your name. That's just, if you want to go to a meeting that has physicians and other healthcare professionals in it. I'll usually go to like one of those a week because I do find it helpful to go to general AA as well, but those because we have unique, stressful
Mhm.
jobs and
Mhm.
different issues we're dealing with, it can be really, really great insight that people give you and support. And so the IDAA group it's just idaa.org, and they have a meeting directory. That basically like some of them are Zoom meetings, some of them are in person. So that's a great place to start. And then uh, I know that Physicians Anonymous also.
Mhm.
It sounds like it's going to be a really great resource, and apparently I might be leading one of the groups at some point soon.
That's
So
very exciting.
yeah, and I'm sure they probably have other resources on those sites too for like additional stuff.
hmm Okay, well, thank you again, Courtney, for being my guest and sharing your story. I really appreciate it, and I'm so grateful that we were able to have this conversation.
My pleasure, Kim. Thank you.
You're welcome. So, in closing, to move the needle in healthcare, we all need to raise our voices and we all need to care about each other. We already know that doctors need to care about patients. Patients need to care about doctors too. So, stand up, doctors, and let's stand up for doctors.